Okay, so continuing where we left off in class, looking at machines versus free weights. So the discussion board post I'm actually going to have you do is what are the advantages and disadvantages when looking at particularly machines. So that's part one of the question. Part two of the question is what do free weights offer? So when we look at the utilizing machines versus free weights, what are kind of the advantages and disadvantages of machines, and then what do free weights offer that machines do not? So answer those in the discussion post. You can use your textbook and get that information. One thing to note is that not all machines are created equal. So there are some good machines out there. So when you're looking kind of at the disadvantages, there are some machines out that can provide some, really good benefit to athletes based on their weak points. So that's the benefit to that. So when you look at utilizing machines, look at what the weak points are. And that those could be some things. Remember, we said that, again, the big primary core lifts will be things that will have a little more direct transfer to force production when you're looking at sports and athletics. But there are some things that isolation exercises can potentially be a benefit for. Okay, looking at instability exercises. So instability exercises are essentially just exercises done on an unstable surface. So think of things like, doing balance exercises on Dynadiscs or Bosus, things of that nature. Any type of unstable surface will be considered an instability exercise. Now, what you do notice with instability exercises is there is increased core activation with them. However, the problem with instability exercises, particularly when used too much, is that there's decreased agonist muscle force produced when you do exercises on unstable surfaces. So there's a reduced rate of force development produced with the exercises. So if you're doing a squat on an unstable surface versus doing it on a stable surface, there's less force produced. So there's a problem there because we find that we need, obviously, one of our goals is to increase force production in the athlete. So the ground-based weight movements are better overall for athletic improvement because they allow for that increased force production. Now, if you're going to use unstable surfaces, there are places where it can be used, but it needs to be used selectively and for the right reasons. You could implement it to just establish a base for balance. Static balance activities are good with this. You can do it with injured individuals when you're trying to get their proprioception back. So it can be used as an adjunct, training someone who is injured, or even for healthy individuals. Again, you just can't make it the main portion of their workout. The basis of the training for athletes should center around ground-based exercises to enable for appropriate force production to be produced. Okay, so looking at variable resistance, so there's three type of resistance that your textbook talks about. So these are the terms that we're going to use. So you have the constant external, accommodating, and variable resistance. So constant external is what you look at with traditional strength training. So this looks at just the load kind of being constant throughout the range of motion. This is what you'll typically see with your traditional movements, barbells and dumbbells. The load remains constant. Accommodating resistance looks at the speed of motion being controlled. So the speed of motion gets controlled. Again, you need special devices in order to do this. So what these special devices will do is they will limit the speed at which the contraction happens. So basically, if an individual utilizing accommodating resistance with an isokinetic machine tries to push harder, apply more force, the machine will push back with force to kind of limit how fast the motion takes place. The variable resistance, which will be what we're focusing on, is where you have resistance that matches changes in the joint leverage. So what essentially happens with constant external loading, so say you're doing a barbell back squat, as you go throughout the range of motion, while the actual load remains constant, the force production changes. So the forces exerted by the muscle will change. So think about when you're doing something like a barbell free weight exercise, like a squat. As you get to the top of the movement, the movement gets easier and easier. What variable resistance does is it looks to make that actually harder at the top. So whereas with a traditional constant external resistance, the load force application gets easier at the top, when you apply variable resistance, it'll actually match the leverage and basically provide you with more resistance at the top of the movement. So what this actually does is it actually allows you to overcome mechanical disadvantages of having the weight getting easier. It actually reduces the deceleration, because with traditional barbell weights, the weight eventually has to come to a stop and you tend to decelerate at the end. Well, with a variable resistance methods, and we're going to talk about two particular type, because the load gets heavier, you actually will not have as much deceleration because you'll basically be accelerating through the lift. So it also provides compensatory acceleration as you have to basically drive through the entire lift because the weight gets heavier and heavier at the top. And the two types of variable resistance we're going to talk about are applying chains to the barbell and applying bands to the barbell, and how each one of those are slightly different in their application. Okay, so utilizing chains for your variable resistance. So basically what you're looking to do when utilizing chains, and you can see some illustrations in your text on the use of chains, there's an overload at the top. So again, this is what we're talking about with variable load resistance, is that what you do is you apply these methods actually to the barbell in the case of your big primary lifts, and you overload the movements where they would typically become easier. So you overload at the top. If you look at the way the chains are set up, now the key with utilizing chains in the case of variable resistance is you want to make sure that some of the chains will be touching the floor. So basically when the chains are on the floor, they deload, and then you will, as you're going through the movement, the chains will gradually come up off the floor and overload the top of the movement. So one of the things in your setup that's important is to make sure you have chains on the floor at the start of the movement, so that the bottom portion where the lift would be harder, you have less weight. You essentially are pushing less weight, but then as you move to the top, the weight gets heavier and heavier. So what this is going to require is what's called an anchor chain. So again, if you look at there's a picture in your textbook on page 415, you can see the individual doing the bench press. They're utilizing an anchor chain to make sure that the chains are actually able to deload at the bottom portion. So there's some chains that they sell where it's just one big chain that hangs off the bar. The problem with that is you're not going to get the deload, as much of a deload at the bottom, so you're not going to match that strength curve quite as readily as you would if you have the anchor chain attached. Okay, and looking at bands. Now bands do some different things. Bands are slightly more advanced. They're also a little bit more stressful than chains. So bands are something that you would progress. If you were starting somebody with these types of resistances, I would start them with chains first and then progress them to bands. So bands accommodate the strength curve. That's also something to note. You will hear some individuals refer to the variable resistance methods as accommodating resistance. Okay, so now for the purposes of class, the accommodating resistance will strictly refer to the isokinetic applications where the speed remains constant. So in case if I ever give you something to read, or you read something in another class that I teach, and the term accommodating resistance gets used, the only reason why they use that with chains and bands is because, again, both of them do accommodate the strength curve. Bands tend to do something a little different. Particularly with bands, what you have to account for is resistance both at the top and bottom of the movement. I do not like the way your textbook illustrates the band usage. If you look at the pictures on page 416 and 417 in your book, the bottom portion of the squat, they're showing the bands on an extreme slack and not providing resistance. You should not apply bands in this manner. They should not have slack at the bottom. However, because bands are elastic at the bottom portion of the movement, they will shrink. However, there should still be resistance at the bottom. So make sure that you have to account for the resistance at the top and the bottom when you do that. One thing bands do that chains do not is they provide an overspeed eccentric. So if you're doing, for instance, a squat, when you're coming down on the eccentric phase and lowering the weight, it actually kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the bands kind of throw you back into the ground. What that does is it allows for greater force production on the concentric. So again, that's good if you can stabilize the weight, and this is where bands are slightly more stressful than chains, and you have to consider that in your application. So it's a good effect, but the person has to be able to utilize it and have it not be too stressful for them. This is where you get into different levels of bar speeds. Your textbook does not talk about it, but I will. Your three different types of bar speeds. You have explosive strength, and strength speed. This is just a continuum of basically how fast the barbell moves, explosive strength being where the barbell moves the fastest, strength speed is where it moves the slowest, and you'll load with free weight and band tension depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So for instance, with explosive strength, obviously this is going to be your lightest resistance. You're typically going to load the barbell only to about 25 to 30% of your 1 rep max. That's the barbell free weight, and then load it with a 30 to 40% of band tension to do explosive strength. So you'll have 25 to 30% barbell weight, 30 to 40% band tension. Speed strength, the weights get a little heavier. This is kind of your intermediate velocity. You'll load the barbell with 50 to 60% of your 1 rep max, and then add an additional 25% of band tension. Strength speed is where the barbell will move the slowest. And what you'll actually be doing here in the case of utilizing variable resistance is you're actually going to add more band tension than barbell weight, but it's going to be very heavy. So, if you're loading the bar with the idea here is at the top, you're going to really overload the weight. So this is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be as strict as the percentages. Just know that with strength speed, the barbell is going to be the slowest, and you will overload it with band tension. So there'll be really, really heavy band tension. So, when powerlifters do this strength speed cycles, what they tend to do is actually the top portion of the lift will actually end up being more than what their 1 rep max is, but they'll be able to accomplish it because at the top of the movement, they could provide more force. So they'll actually have really, really heavy band tension and not as much barbell weight. Okay, looking at strongman exercises, there's various forms of strongman training that you can use. Tire flipping is very, very popular, and I made mention of this. This is very good and can be used for some athletes. Again, there's some applications where you should probably not utilize tire flipping. I gave the example in class about a swimmer. It's probably not great for them. But for some of your more strength and power-based athletes, tire flipping can be a really great thing. There's a couple factors to consider when you're utilizing tire flipping. So, and typically people just go and try to get tires from tire yards, or they're disposing their old tires. you got to be careful with what you select, okay? So you have to consider the tire width. So wider tires tend to be more difficult for shorter athletes. Narrower tires tend to be more difficult for taller athletes. So you want to make sure that, you know, the tire width is going to accommodate for your athletes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The tire height, the taller the tire, the harder it typically is to flip due to the mechanical disadvantage that you have. So one of the things you want to make sure is that the tire should not be taller than the athlete's upright standing height, okay? So you want to you do have to kind of match the tire's dimensions with the athlete. That's to get kind of the optimal results. So you want to make sure that that all kind of lines up. The treads, you want to make sure that that the treads are appropriate. Obviously, if the treads are worn down, that could affect the grip. You also want to make sure that you look at, if you have very pronounced treads, there may potentially be debris or exposed metal in them as well. So, you know, just basically, you know, the take-home point is look at the size of the tire, compare it with your athletes, look through the treads. If the treads are worn down, it's going to be difficult to grip. If not, make sure that there's still no debris or metal kind of sticking out that would injure the athletes. Now, there's different techniques, and I'm highlighting here on page 418. Look at the different techniques, the flaws, and how you would want to spot. I still think spotting this is very difficult. You need to make sure you have at least 2 other individuals, one on each side, to make sure when you're spotting this. The 3 techniques that you have are the sumo lift, the back lift, and the shoulder against tire. The shoulder against tire technique is the most preferred, and that's kind of the one highlighted in your book. The sumo style is what you would think of with like the sumo deadlift, with just the wide stance and the arms in a narrower grip. Again, the issue is sometimes you have a little bit of a disadvantage with that. The back lift style is basically performed with like a conventional deadlift stance. Again, you do lose some advantage to that so now you're a little bit more hip width as you would with a conventional deadlift, and they consider that the back lift style. The shoulder against tire is a little bit more traditional, and this is what you see most people actually using, and that technique is actually highlighted in your textbook. If you look at page 428, it goes through how to use the shoulder against tire technique. So what you're actually doing with the shoulder against tire technique is that you're kind of leaning into the tire at the start of the movement, and you actually utilize your knee. Once you pick up the tire and fully extend, you actually use your knee to kind of help kick the tire up and allow you to push it over. So you can kind of see that on the technique for that. And again, that's usually the one that most people will utilize. They just think overall it's the safest. So again, note that chart on page 418. Look at the different flaws. Look at how you should spot the lift. Again, you're going to have individuals positioned on both sides to spot, and they're basically going to spot the lift by just assisting the athlete by pushing on the tire when needed. You need to make sure that they don't lose their grip, and just be aware of the area around as the athlete is flipping the tire. All right, some more strongman training stuff. Log lifting tends to be another exercise utilized a lot. And basically what they do with log lifting, as far as the exercises go, they basically do like a variation of the clean when they do it. There's other traditional exercises you can do. You can do just straight presses with it. The jerk lift you can do rows, you can do squats, you can do deadlifts. Usually what you see traditionally being done with log lifts is the clean and press or the clean and jerk with it. And basically what you essentially do with it is that now they actually make devices for this now. So there's weighted versions, so that you don't have to have different weighted logs in order to do this. They actually make special devices that you can actually load weight plates on with the handles when you're utilizing them. So this is just another thing, and that's actually what you can see this in your textbook on 430 and 431. That's actually a device utilized. You can put weight plates on the end of it, and you can see them doing a log clean and press on that in that illustration. So again, it's just another exercise that you can use. Again, your loading will be based upon what it is you're trying to accomplish with it. Again, whether it's more or less effective, we don't know. There is some increase in some stabilizer muscles. Another kind of interesting thing that some people utilize to add kind of an unstable variation to this is they use logs with water resistance. So what it actually is a log filled with water, so that as you're doing the exercise, there's the individual also has to stabilize the load, because as you're going through the exercise, so if you see the exercise in the text, so now picture that with basically a big tube filled with water. What that's going to do is increase activation of the stabilizer muscles. Again, it's just another variation that you could utilize. Again, this is a fine exercise to use. You just want to make sure that your loading parameters are what they need to be to get out of it what you need. Okay, so looking at another type, this is of all this is just a personal opinion, but of all the strongman stuff, this is probably the one that I think probably has the greatest carryover to most athletes, is the farmer's walk or the loaded walk. This is something where basically the athlete or the individual will hold loads at the side of the body while walking forward. There's various ways you can utilize this. You could use dumbbells. You can actually use the farmer's walk yokes, if you will, the specialized things that they can. Again, you could load weights on, but basically any type of load held at your sides while you're walking will provide this. The physical benefits to this, again, you're going to get, you can get anaerobic endurance from it, strengthening the low back and abdomen, grip strength are all things that you can use. It's believed that using farmer's walk can enhance the traditional resistance training, because again, it just kind of challenges the body while you're actually walking and carrying the resistance. So you could perform it with static loads, utilizing again, heavy dumbbells or the actual farmer's walk implements, or you can utilize different things that provide variable resistance or even unstable loads. So some people will use things like water-filled objects, doing farmer's walks where instead of holding two weights, a weight in each hand, you're only going to hold it on one side of the body. That will change kind of the abdomen as far as how the activation pattern will be in the muscles there. So there's various ways you can do this, and again, the results you get from it, whether it's anaerobic endurance, pure strength improvement, grip strength, will all depend upon the parameters in which you program it for. So again, this is something that could be very beneficial as far as strengthening the pelvic and core region, strengthening the hips, and strengthening the low back. Are some of the benefits to utilizing the farmer's walk. Okay, looking at kettlebells. So kettlebells are another type of resistance you can use. There's two different pictures of kettlebells, and we'll talk about what the difference is between the two different types. So examples of some exercises, the typical exercises you see people do that are kind of specific to kettlebells are the kettlebell swing, the clean, and the snatch. There's obviously other exercises you can do with them. You can do things like goblet squats where you hold the load in front, much like you can do with a dumbbell. And there's various others. Some people like to do different types of pressing exercises with kettlebells because they offer a slightly different resistance. But the swing, clean, and snatch are the kind of the traditional kettlebell exercises that you see getting done. Now, there's some caveats to point out. So that your textbook talks about how they're not as beneficial for improving max strength. You can certainly improve strength with kettlebells. Again, sometimes the way studies get performed, you kind of look at it weird. For instance, they look at them as they cite a study in your textbook about back squat strength increases, and they say that, well, they don't improve back squat strength as much as a traditional weightlifting program. Well, obviously, if you're doing a weightlifting program where you're actually doing squats and you're doing a weightlifting program where all you're doing is kettlebell swings, obviously the squats are going to improve more with that. Again, you look at things as far as how they can improve weak points. So I personally don't think that kettlebells should necessarily replace, traditional barbell, weightlifting and strength training based exercises. However, they can be still utilized and incorporated appropriately and get some benefits from, particularly when you look at some of the different exercises. Now, when you look here, the different types, so if you look at this picture here, you notice these kettlebells here, okay, they're all different sizes. So obviously this one here is the lightest one. You go across, that's the heaviest one. These are all the same. So these are kind of like your traditional cast iron kettlebells. These down here are what are called competition kettlebells. So there actually are competitions where people compete utilizing kettlebell exercises. The sport kettlebells, or the competition ones that you see down here, they're utilized, they're all the same size, but they're still different weights. So the idea there is they standardize the size so that there's not an advantage per se to using a lighter kettlebell. So that's one of the characteristics. And one's not necessarily better than the other. It's just that they're just designed differently because the competition kettlebells, they have to, obviously if it's a competition, they have to standardize the size in order to do them. Another consideration with kettlebells is the grip. So, your textbook talks about how with cast iron kettlebells, the handle diameter changes slightly as the weight increases. So as the weight gets bigger, the kettlebell handle also gets bigger as well. So the smaller kettlebells will have a smaller handle. Again, that's different from the competition kettlebells, which they all have the same size handle. Also, the space between the top and bottom of the handle changes when you look at the size of the kettlebells as well. There's also one thing to consider, because these things could be the kettlebells could be very taxing on the grip and on your hands. So with regard to the handle surface, there's kettlebells that come with smooth painted surfaces, and others have polished steel handles, which don't have any paint. They're basically just bare metal. The polished steel handles tend to be better for grip because it holds on. You can get a better grip on it. If people are using chalk, it holds chalk better, and it doesn't get as slippery as the painted handles. So that could be something that you consider if you're looking at buying kettlebells for your athletes and for your weight room. Okay, so looking at unilateral training, so some examples of unilateral exercises. Again, basically anything where you're primarily going to put stress on one side of the body. Now, you can do this with upper body exercises as well, but we'll look at this from the standpoint of lower body exercises. So lunges, step-ups, single leg squats, Bulgarian split squats. These are all examples of unilateral training. And usually you'll integrate these into a training program as auxiliary exercises, as ways to reduce bilateral asymmetries where one leg or one side is maybe stronger than the other, or as a rehabilitation tool. Now, in looking at how to apply this, you have to look at two concepts. One is the concept of bilateral deficit. So sometimes these exercises will be used to reduce bilateral deficit. So this is where there's asymmetries in force production between unilateral and bilateral movements. So what a bilateral deficit is if you look at, is when in an individual, and you typically see this in weaker or untrained people, what ends up happening is when you add up the force that can be produced in unilateral movement, so adding what can be done with both legs as the primary mover, they actually develop more force that way than when they're doing a more traditional bilateral movement. So in other words, you add up how much force can be done in a split squat with one leg and then the other leg, it'll actually end up being more than what can get produced in a bilateral movement like a squat, okay? That's as opposed to what trained or stronger individuals exhibit, and that's called bilateral facilitation. So this is where there's an increase in activation in the agonist muscle groups when they're utilizing both legs at the same time. So trained or stronger individuals tend to exhibit bilateral facilitation, whereas untrained, injured, or weaker individuals tend to exhibit a bilateral deficit. So therefore, when you're looking at the response, again, unilateral methods shouldn't necessarily be used to per se increase a whole lot of strength in trained or very strong individuals. They can still be utilized as a technique just to kind of work on for auxiliary movements, but they're not going to increase a whole lot of strength in trained and stronger individuals. So again, you look at the benefits versus drawbacks. Unilateral methods can be really good. If you're going to focus on it for untrained and weaker or injured individuals to kind of work on that bilateral deficit. But if you do have stronger people, again, not to say that they can't be used for them. However, it's going to be more of like a secondary exercise just to kind of work on the individual muscle groups as an auxiliary or assistance exercise. Your learning outcomes. So again, address that the question that I have for the discussion board on the free weights versus machines, and we'll continue with some further discussion with this in class.